What's up, everybody? Happy New Year! Welcome back. Welcome back. What a blessing it is. I got to tell you, it's good to go on vacation. It's really important to go on vacation. And then it's like, vacation. Well, I don't know, where did we go? But it's good to have some time off to think and just sort of let everything settle. But not too much. I really, in the end, started to miss this community, started to just miss learning together. So it's a real blessing to be back for another year, semester, another run through this Mishna that we've been moving our way through. So let's just start with a blessing, thanking God for the space that we have to learn together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right, we are back. So we're back, but we're back in the middle of a tour that we've been taking through the Mishnah, and we're in the first. Their Mishnah is divided into 6 sections. Mishnah, the early rabbinic code, if anyone's just joining us for the first time, compiled in the 3rd century. And we're in the first section of the Mishnah, which is the section of agricultural law, which, I don't know, as I even say that out loud, it's like, that doesn't sound so exciting unless you're a farmer. And yet we've been sort of moving through it and selecting out really interesting, unusual, exciting pieces. That's sort of the method here. We're moving through the Mishnah, but we're looking at the highlights. But we are right now in the order that we're following. We've arrived at Masechet Masrot, which I will translate. Masechet Masrot is we translate usually into tithes. Difficult word to say. Tithes. Tithes, which is like the donation, the tithing system, easier to say tithing, tithes, which comes from the word, or is related to the word, an English word actually, right? Do you know which word tithe is related to? Tithe is, I see some people doing it. Rose is putting her hands up. Tenth. A tithe is a tenth. Okay, so that already takes us a long way. The tithing system is the tenthing system, the giving of 1/10. Okay, so I think some of us have some familiarity, and we'll circle back to this at the end, with the idea that in Jewish, I don't even want to say law yet, but our practice in the Jewish community is to give 1/10 of one's income to charity. Okay, that clearly sounds like it's based on the tithing system, but as we'll soon see, it's not so clear exactly how we get from the tithing system to this. And part of what the main thing that I want to do with you all today is just to kind of stop for a second and ask, what is the tithing system? What is that system? Because when I arrive at Masechet Masrot, this tractate, I have to say, I felt a little bit like, oh my gosh, we're going to start the year off on this. This is so, this is not the most exciting stuff in the Mishnah. Let me just give you an example of the way that it starts here before I share the sheet with you. Here's the beginning of the Masechet. They said a general principle concerning tithes. Whatever is food and is looked after and grows from the land is liable for tithes. Okay, so now we're talking what can be tithed or tenthed or taken a part out of, and it seems like the Mishnah wants to rush in and say it's food, it's only food, and it's food that grows out of the land, and it's food that that is actually watched over in the agricultural system. And then they have another rule, which is whatever is considered food, both at the beginning and the conclusion of its growth, even though he holds on to it in order to increase the quantity of food, is liable to tithe whether it is harvested in its earlier or later stage. I'm not even gonna keep reading, but the law there, I mean, it's like already so dense and, you know, I mean, sure, it's law, and we would do well to study the particulars, but they're so particular. So the law there was, if something is already food ready, like a vegetable, then it's immediately obligated to tithing. But if it's something that's not yet food ready, like a grain, which has to be processed, then it's not obligated ready, or you're not obligated yet to tithe it until you turn it into grain. Okay, so that's like, we're getting now into the particulars, exactly how this system works. But what's really important, I think, for us today in thinking about this system is that it takes us to, it seems in some ways very archaic, very ancient, but it takes us, of course, to think about a very, very, very important social institution, which is taxes. This is essentially the Jewish tax system. I went to law school, and I had a professor who, one of my advisors was a tax law professor, and he was the most fascinating guy. So you would think, like, why did you choose tax law? Like, he taught constitutional law and tax law, and he used to say, I love tax law because it's such a closed and clear system. As long as you know the rule, I mean, it's a mess, but you know the rules, and then you can just plug it into the formula and like figure out what the law is, as opposed to the rest of the law, which is, you know, chaotic and murky and debatable. So taxes can be straightforward in one way. Like, there's a system, and that is what we're here today to do, is to understand what is the Jewish system, tax system or tithe system. But of course, taxes are also hugely controversial, right? It's straightforward in one way, but the actual choice of what kind of tax system a society mandates is one of the huge controversies in our country, surely, and I think in all state structures. Now, let me begin to open the conversation up and ask you, before we even get to the material, just because I want us thinking about taxes really this whole time. I want us to understand the ancient system, but I also want us to be thinking, what are our actual values around taxation? And I think the debate is usually like, it is as if we speak as if the debate is like between people who don't like taxes and people who are for taxes. But that's not a real debate, because the no taxes position is a straw man. That is, I mean, I suppose in an anarchistic society there are no taxes, but the minute you start offering social services, and even the most small scale state visions, imagine the military or the police as a social service. As the minute you start to imagine social services, you have to, that's where are you paying these people? How are you supporting these people? So even if you're just a Robert Nozick, you know, nothing but the military vision of the government, then nevertheless, you believe that there should be some kind of tax. The main debate, I would say, that is live in our society around taxes is the debate between a flat tax and a progressive tax. Everybody know those terms, a flat tax and a scaled tax. So a flat tax is everybody pays the same percentage of their income. People have different incomes, but everybody pays the same percentage. We all pay, let's use 10%, right? Because that's tithe. Imagine we all pay 10, and as I say it that way, it seems like, oh, I guess the Jewish system was a flat tax. It's not exactly true, as we'll soon see, but it's helpful to think about. Flat tax, same percentage for everybody. As opposed to a progressive tax, or a scaled tax, which usually works, you know, in some kind of principle of the more money you make, the greater the percentage of the tax you pay. So if you're on the lower end of income, you might pay 10%. If you're on the higher end of income, you might pay 25, 30, 50%, right? And we have this debate in our society. Now, let me ask you, as we begin I've been talking now for 10 minutes. Let me ask you, do you have strong opinions on this? I mean, I know I teach in a progressive community, and I know that the progressive position tends to be, in that case, like it's a perfect sync, is the progressive tax system or the scaled tax system. So would anyone like to vote for either a flat tax or a progressive tax as a more just system, and a little bit just articulate why you choose one or the other? Would anyone like to begin our conversation this year just by thinking about that? I think I saw Matt's hand go up. Yeah, please, Matt.
I'm strongly in favor of progressive taxes. I think it's one of the most important issues that we face as a society, to be honest with you, because I'm also a citizen of Germany. The taxes are more progressive there, and I see how it influences Germany positively. Okay,
we got one vote for progressive tax. I called it one of the most important issues in our society, you know, having that kind of tax system. But I want to turn to other voices, but I also want to hear why progressive tax. Let's see, I've got Rosa next.
Okay, so I live in Canada, so we definitely have progressive tax. And I think it's while I sometimes resent it like crazy, however, I also realize that it is the only way to conduct a society. And the reason for that is a person that's making $20,000 a year and is paying 10% of their taxes is still only left with $18,000 a year. Whereas a person that's earning $1 million a year and pays 10% is left with a heck of a lot more. The basic cost of living remains the same, whether you're rich or poor. So therefore, the wealthier you are, the more money you make, the more you should be paying to support the lower earning populations, because otherwise, and it happens anyway, because our progressive tax isn't really that progressive, that you have the bulk of the money residing in 5% of the population.
Great. Okay, great. So Rose is saying a lot there. Let me just extract a few, I think, key points. First of all, I just want to thank Rosa for acknowledging that even those of us who might support a progressive tax system are operating from the same basic human self-interested place where nobody likes paying taxes. Okay, that's part of what the tension is. Nobody, you know, I mean, you know, this is one of soon to be former President Trump's positions, is like, yeah, I have tried to scheme my way through the taxes, but everybody would do that. And there is a kind of logic to that. Everybody would like to pay as little as possible. But when we think about the big system, Barry, I'm hearing a lot of noise from your computer. Can you
hear me?
No, can you hit mute? Yeah, thanks. Okay, so that's one point. Now as for the reason for the progressive system, Rosa says, the idea is simple. The first point is, if we need more money for social services than a flat tax could provide, then Barry, I have you coming unmuted a lot. Barry Swartz.
Yeah.
Can you mute yourself?
Unmute?
Mute.
Okay.
Thank you. So the idea is, when we start needing more than, let's say, 10%, starting to take more and more of a percentage of a person who earns lower income leaves them in an increasingly, Barry, I continue to hear you. So
okay, can I say something?
Yeah, but when I call on people, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Just there's a lot of noise coming from the background in your computer. Thanks. So the idea is that that someone with a greater income is more able to shoulder the great social burden, right? So I just want to, like, that's a fairly straightforward way of articulating the reasoning behind a progressive system. But I just wonder if I want to ask the question, because I am in a kind of a left-leaning community. I want to try and consider also the other position. And I guess I wonder, let me put it this way. If a flat tax could take care of the needs of everybody in society, isn't it actually more fair to have everybody paying this? Like, is that ideal? Like, the best thing would be everybody pays the same percentage because we're all giving the same share. And a progressive tax is a kind of concession to, well, we need more money. We have to turn to the wealthier people, right? Like, that's just one way of asking the question. Like, is there some justice or logic to the flat tax? Okay, I'm going to go now to Payam.
Well, complicating things. I mean, it's not a black and white. There's also like value-added taxes, which are, based on the production and where along the scale, who uses it. I mean, we don't want to really get into that tax discussion because no one understands it. But if you look at like the system you explained before, it's almost a VAT tax based on where it's produced and where it's going. And I think that's sort of like where Andrew Yang and a lot of the more, it's almost in the middle of the two in terms of a taxation system. But,
you mean Jewish law?
Well, I mean, that is part of like what the European Union and based on, like when you looked at in terms of Jewish law, when you looked at the previous one where you were talking about when it's made into a product, that's the basic idea of a VAT tax based on the production scale and who uses it and who benefits from it.
Okay. Thank you for that, Payam. And as you said, you do helpfully complicate matters because then we can also start to think about taxing in a way that addresses specific social uses, like the tax to cross a bridge, right? Or the tax on certain kinds of products like alcohol or tobacco, right? Like, and why we would make there is, by the way, and we're not going to spend much time on it today, but there is such a tax in Jewish law. There's the cattle tax, right? There's a particular tax for those raising cattle. That's separate from the rest of the system. But we can't, Payam notes, and he's right, that part of what's important about our conversation is keeping our eyes on what gets taxed, okay? Because even as the Mishna opens and say, well, no, only food, that's quite a restriction, right? You think about all the other things that might be property taxes, and that doesn't seem like it's present in the Jewish legal system. All right, I want to take a couple more comments, and then we're going to start looking. We're sort of talking at 10,000 feet, but let's start looking at the actual tax system. So, Alan, you had a thought. Alan Kozlev?
Trying to unmute, sorry. On the phone, it's a little bit harder to hit the little thing. Yeah, it's very interesting because a lot of the comments you made kind of put it together, but the fact is, and like this is going off of what Rosa said, poorer people are hit more with any type of tax, like a sales tax, a VAT. These all, the poorer you are, the higher a percentage of your income these taxes become, and the more likely they are to impinge on your ability to get basic human needs. And so the progressive tax, first off, we used to have a very progressive tax in the United States that if you made over a certain amount of money, I'm going to make up a number here, let's say $1 million today, you would pay like 90% of it. And
right.
So the actual take-home pay of a CEO of a company was only 10, 15 times the pay of the person working on the assembly line. Where nowadays, the take-home, because the tax is like only 20% for federal, forgetting all the other taxes, the take-home pay can be 5,000 times more for the CEO than it is for the person working on the assembly line. And there is an inherent unfairness to that, which a flat tax would not address. And so my two main points is that, and also the fact that if you do have a flat tax, you have to have a point below which it doesn't apply, so that acknowledging that people have to be able to afford the basic necessities of living.
That's great. Okay, some very helpful points. Just as we're sort of stirring the pot here and trying to see all the main concerns in this taxation conversation. And one is, okay, just to build on, as Alan did on Rosa's explanation in defense of a progressive tax system, one of the things that we are hearing in these descriptions of the justice of the progressive tax system, the more you make, the greater percentage, one of the assumptions is that part of the point of taxes is to take care of the poor, is to provide social services, not to everybody, but to everybody, and in particular to those who fall below some kind of subsistence line, right? And Alan goes so far as to say, and indeed, there is some threshold beneath which you shouldn't be paying taxes at all. Now, that's an important point. You might not argue that taxes are meant to take care of the poor. You might say taxes are for what we all use, like roads, shared social services, and not to help some people, right? Now, in Jewish law, I don't think we need to have much of a debate over whether you're obligated to take care of the poor. That's part of our legal system. Though how it plays into taxes is not yet entirely clear. But that's one of the things that we're saying when we say a progressive tax is that it's not just we need a little more money for the military and the roads. It's that we need to take some from you because on the other end of the scale, some people don't have enough, just simply don't have enough to live. And okay, so that's important. And I think it's important to articulate part of, I think, one of the underlying sensibilities here, and Alan begins to articulate it, is that I don't know how else to put it, but like you shouldn't have too much money. Like it doesn't make sense, or at least proportionally, it doesn't make sense for some people to control too much of the wealth in society. It's just not fair. They have too much power. But like we don't want a society where some people make 5,000 times the amount of, I mean, like that's a joke when you think about like Jeff Bezos. How many times does he make what I make, or what anyone I think I can guess on this Zoom makes, right? So there's something wrong with that. Okay, I want to take Barry because we connected earlier, and then I want to dive into the material. Barry?
Yes. The first problem that you have with the tax system in Canada is, first of all, it was a temporary tax to begin with. It started in 1914, and it was there for war purposes. It's still a temporary tax, but nobody's going to get rid of it. Okay?
In other words, Barry, you're saying the very idea that it's a progressive tax is something that was thought of perhaps as a stopgap measure and not an ideal, a permanent institution.
That's right.
That might be an argument for maybe there are times when we need a progressive tax. That's very interesting to consider. All right, great. Thank you, Barry. Mute yourself again.
Okay.
Because your room is particularly loud. But excellent point. Thank you. All right, so listen, we're 25 minutes in. We haven't seen any material, and I hope to cover the entire Jewish tithing system. So let's get into it a little bit. And I have to say, here's the source sheet that we're going to use today. But I have to say, I cannot resist, even though what I should do is take you right into the details of the tax system. I can't resist going back a little bit and looking at some of the roots of the tax system, because there are a couple of episodes before we get now I'm just saying taxes, but let's not forget we're talking about tithing, masrot. Before we get to the system of tithing, there are a couple of instances where it already seems to be present in ancient Hebrew society. So who is the first person to tithe? Anyone know or guess? Or just click to your sheet and see it. The first person to tithe, actually, you might say that Cain and Abel were doing some kind of like, Abel gave me bechorot hatzon, the best of his flock, but that's pretty vague. There's an explicit reference to tithing, and I think it's a fascinating one. And I want to just give us this scene as a way of kind of articulating maybe what some of the values are behind the Jewish tithing system, okay? the Torah's tithing system. So let's take a look here. The first person is a very early person in the Torah's narrative, is Abraham. And it's so early that he's not even Abraham yet, he's Avram. Okay, so this scene follows a war that Abraham fought when he heard that Lot, his nephew, had been taken captive. Right, there's a war going on, and Abraham hears that his own kinsman is involved in that war, and so he goes in and helps fight the war, and apparently wins the war. Right, so this is part of the Abraham story, not one we discuss a lot, but there he goes, and he mustered his retainers born into his household, 318, and they went in pursuit. At night, he went and he defeated them, and in verse 16, he brought back all the possessions. These are the spoils of war, or at least just the possessions of all of those he had saved. And he also brought back his kinsman Lot and his possessions and the women and the rest of the people, and they returned, right? And then here's the scene, okay, verse 18. And King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him, saying, "Blessed be Avram of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your foes into your hand." And here it is. This is the first mention of what we would call a tithe. Vayiten lo maser mikol. Here's the word in Hebrew. And Abraham gave Melchizedek, who had just given him this blessing, a tenth of everything. Okay, now, that just kind of comes out of nowhere. Abraham's like, here's 10% for you. Why? Why does Abraham give this guy a tenth? What's the reason behind his what is ostensibly the first tithe? Anybody feel like they sense what's Abraham's motivation here? What's a Rosa?
Well, King Melchizedek was there to help everybody, and he helped Abraham. And I think Abraham felt that he had to donate towards the maintenance of the society. Okay.
But how is he there to help everyone? What does the King Melchizedek represent? What does Abraham feel that he needs to reward? I saw Robert also had a hand. Robert, do you have a thought?
Well, it's tradition that kings, when they fight wars, they have to pay their military. And how are you going to do that? Usually you tax or you borrow from some Jews.
Yeah. Okay. So pay back to all those who have helped, like everybody who's involved. And that does seem to be the discussion that is taking place here. Like, who gets what? How do we just divide the spoil? But just pay attention here to who Melchizedek is in particular. Right? Melchizedek is a priest, a Kohen, same word that we use for our priest, a Kohen of God Most High. And he blessed Abraham, and then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything, right? So, like, there's some relationship there between the blessing and the religious figure, the priest who gives the blessing, and Abraham kind of responds by paying him back a tenth of everything. So this is just early stories. This is not like the laws of tithing, but we do have just like a little bit of a sense that maybe the point of tithing is something to do with blessing, receiving blessing, and that it's religious in nature, actually, and that there would be someone who would be the recipient of that tithe. In other words, there would be someone who is the representative of religious blessing, of God's blessing, and you would pay that person the tithe. Okay, that's going to become very important for us. So it's an old just sort of fragment of a story, but it actually does serve a very important purpose here. Now, this is probably too much information, but I just can't resist because it feels so related to me. The very next thing that happens, and I want to just leave this in the air unless someone's got, like, if someone has a great insight. But the next thing that happened after Abraham gives this tithe is that Abraham, then the king of Sodom, said to Abraham, give me the persons, but take the possessions for yourself. In other words, you can have everything. I want my people back, but you can keep all of the spoils of war, everything that you have. You don't have to give me my share. But Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I swear to the eternal God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, I will not take so much as a thread or a sandal strap of what is yours. You shall not say, it is I who made Avram rich. Now, I don't know exactly what to do with that, but it feels very important to me that the very first instance that we see Abraham giving over a tenth in a particular way, we also right next to it see him saying, like, I don't want gifts. I don't want a free ride. I don't want more than my share. I'm not sure exactly how to relate this to our conversation, but I just want to put out there that this is all taking place in the context of Abraham articulating some kind of ethic of the division of collective wealth, right?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please, Marianka.
Okay, I'm just wondering, is what he's saying is it a tax or is it a tribute to?
It's a good question. It's a really good question.
The king, the superior of the land.
Yeah,
that's my question. Thank you.
It's a great question, and we'll just let it stand as a question because the question makes the point. Maybe this isn't taxes. Maybe taxes are about social services. This is a tribute. Great word Marianka uses. This is a tribute. This is a way of saying, like, I am so grateful to God, to you for this blessing. I'm just donating. Okay, let's keep that in mind. And that's actually the next little fragment that I wanted to give you before we get into the laws of tithing. Also comes from the book of Genesis and is also one of the patriarchs. The other mention of tithing is Jacob, after he has the dream of Jacob's ladder, where God promises Jacob that, all the classic promise, the land and the descendants and all of these things, and you're going to be okay, and I'm going to take care of you, and et cetera, et cetera. Jacob says the following. So this is just like for the purpose of kind of like some sense of what is the language of tithing and that it already exists before we get to the law. And here's the second example. Jacob then made a vow saying, if God remains with me, if God protects me on this journey that I'm making and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return safe to my father's house, then the Eternal shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's abode, and all that you give me, aser asrenu, I will tenth it for you. I will set aside a tithe for you. Okay, so if we're using just sort of the legends of our ancestors to think about the values behind tithing, right? We've got Abraham giving a tenth to the priest that gives him a blessing, refusing, I don't know, more than his share to another king who wants to just sort of do a deal, and then Jacob giving a tenth of everything that if you, God, support me, I will give a tenth to you. Okay, so I'd love to hear. I see a hand. Maggie's got a hand, and Yonatan. It's just like, are we seeing a value here? Are we seeing if these are the earliest tithes, what do they represent? So Maggie, do you have a thought?
Yeah, so my thought, I have two comments regarding that. One, how did Abram decide, or how was the decision made that 10% was enough? That's one. My second comment is, I think the reason why Abram said, I'm not taking anything more than what you have, not even a thread, is because he didn't want anybody to say, one, I made you rich, and two, you owe me. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't want that to be part of the nations that God had said, you will multiply and become a great nation. Why would he put his people in a place that they owe something to somebody?
Okay, great. Two excellent points. Thank you, Maggie. One, let's just name that we're talking a tenth. Why that number? Why is that the obvious number? Is it because we have 10 fingers? It's just like, I don't know, like the easiest fraction to make? Or is 10 a good number? That is one of the questions we actually ought to ask about our own tzedakah system. Should we only give 10%? Right? Should we give more? Should we give less? Can you decide if you can afford more or less than 10%? Right? But okay, so that's one question. The other thing that Maggie begins to do, which I think is very important, is to articulate an ethic that Abraham might be also articulating, that is not just specific to this moment. Yes, Abraham gives a tenth to the priest as a way of, I don't know, tribute or acknowledging God's service in all of this. But Abraham then immediately articulates this, what kind of an ethic of, I don't want to be in a position of debt, and I don't want to be in a position of we owe each other, and I don't want to be in a position of like, yeah, it's like you did me a favor and I'll do you a favor. In other words, we don't want to live in a system where people sort of live and die based on like the goodwill or the slick dealing of others, and especially of the powerful, right? Like that's not the way that there should be or maybe Abraham is saying, I choose a tenth because it's a number, and there should be an orderly system, and you should get a certain amount. And when your taxes go to the poor, you didn't do them a favor. That's the system, right? So that's important, and that's part of why taxes are important, and as opposed to just charity, right? Okay, so I think that's a very important point to consider. Yonatan has got a hand up.
So we've talked a lot about the poor. I think that this tithing system actually has to do with something different. It has to do with a decision that we see worship as a collective labor, that there are people who are professional worshipers. In this case, it's Melachit Tzedek, but later it becomes Kohanim, and that they do work that not all of us know how to do. That work does not sustain them themselves. They need to be sustained, and we believe in that system, and we want to buy into it.
Great, that is so helpful, Yonatan. Takes us right into the material that we want to turn to next. And the way Yonatan puts it is important, I think, for us to keep in mind, to remind ourselves, because it's not so intuitive for us. It seems like, oh, this is like we're doing this for religious reasons. It's different than taxes. But as Yonatan puts it, the idea is that the function of the temple, for example, and the system of offerings, or the function of blessings, is like the military, is like healthcare, is like education. It's just one of the things in this society that is considered to keep us functioning. And some people are going to have to do that, and we need collectively to support that system. Okay,
there's one more thing I wanted to say along the same veins, which is even earlier in Genesis, like the reason that agriculture exists is because of sin, right? That we were designed as creatures to live in a world where all our needs were taken care of. And in fact, it's only because we ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge that we even need to put in labor into growing these fruits and vegetables and grains that we can't even eat in their entirety, right? So there's a system that's being established wherein the rules are being laid down of how we can take care of our physical and spiritual needs in parallel.
Okay, so you're saying some very, very profound sort of theological, you're framing this like going all the way back, that there's some sense that we get from the Torah's narrative that actually our very toil on the land is a curse, and we've fallen from a state where none of this would be necessary. Let me just add to that and say, and so it is that it's not just what could have been, but we now are in a continual state of needing God's assistance for the land to grow at all, and the things that can get in the way are our own transgressions, right? And I'm not asking you necessarily to sign on to any of this just yet, but let's understand the logic of the system. Our transgressions can get in the way of good yield. And so when we have good yield, we have to thank God. And when we have sins, we have to atone for them. And that's the whole system. That's the sacrificial system. And guess what? Somebody has got to perform those sacrifices for us. Right? Someone's got to know how to, I mean, maybe you think like differently, but the Torah seems to believe that certain kinds of connections to God can only be achieved through an offering. And there are certain people appointed to give the offering. Okay, so let's take a look at those people and what they get. And what we're going to do now is map out a system that has 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. Okay, 4 layers. And it's really 3A and 3B, so 4 layers. Okay, here's the first layer. Let's take a look. The first layer is this, and it's articulated in Deuteronomy, the Levitical priests. The whole tribe of Levi, they shall have no territorial portion with Israel. They shall live only off the Eternal's offerings by fire as their portion. Okay, that's a huge thing. Let's just take in the magnitude of what's just been said. The tribes of Israel are 12. The land of Israel is divided up into 12 sections, and everybody gets an area, plot of land to live in and to farm and to own into their hereditary portion, but not the tribe of Levi, the tribe that Moses and Aaron come from. They don't get any land. They don't own anything. So that's a huge deal. Let's just keep that in mind. They don't own anything. They live off of the Eternal's offering. So here's how that works. This then shall be the priest's due from the people. Everyone who offers a sacrifice, whether an ox or a sheep, must give the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach to the priest. So whenever you give a sacrifice, part of it goes to the priest. And you shall also give him the first fruits of your new grain and wine and oil, the first shearing of your sheep. For the Eternal your God has chosen him and his descendants out of all your tribe to be in attendance for the service in the name of the Eternal for all time. Okay, so what we're describing here is called truma. Truma, which literally means contribution. Okay, so who do we contribute this to? Who is this for? Okay, it's a short answer, so I'm not going to insist. The Levites, good. But in this case, it's not all the Levites, it's the priests. Okay, and it's a little blurry. The lines here are a little blurry, and it's like a little bit difficult to distinguish, but because we opened with the priests, and the general setting is the Levites have no territorial portion, but this is going to be what you owe to the priests, which is a certain family within the Levites, Aaron's family. Okay, and what you owe them is this truma, which is the part of the offering and the first of all of the grains and the wine. How much do you give them for truma? Just think about this, or look at the text. How much do you give them? Is it a tenth? It's not. It's not a tenth. The language of maser, right? Tithing. This is considered the first tithe, but it's not really a tithe. It's just a donation to the priest, and it's called truma, the donation. And you can fulfill it actually with any amount. I presume in some ways it has to do with how many offerings are given. Okay, but that's just for the priest. That's truma. That's stage 1. Okay, here's stage 2, and we're still talking about the Levites, and now Yonatan's guess is going to this is where Yonatan's guess lands. Or not really guess. Yonatan's reading the verses, but they are blurry. It seems like we're talking about the whole Levite tribe, but here note that we're talking about the Levitical priests in particular, la kohanim halavim. Okay, now, now here, and I'm taking the best places where these are articulated in the Torah. There are some repetitions, but here's the second tithe. Or really, it's the first tithe. It's called Maser Rishon, the first tithe, because the actual first donation is just called Truma, the donation. Okay, and to the Levites, I hereby give all the tithes in Israel as their share in return for the services that they perform, the services of the tent of meeting. Israelites must not trespass on the tent of meeting and thus incur guilt and die. Okay, so this is important because this is what Yonatan was saying. not everybody has access to the temple, to the system of offerings. Certain people have been designated for that. And actually, it's dangerous for the rest of us to go into the temple. Like, God's presence is overwhelming. Only the Levites shall perform the services of the tent of meeting. Others would incur guilt. It is the law for all time throughout the ages, but they shall have no territorial share among the Israelites. For it is the tithes, and here's the language of Maser, the tenth. It is the tithes set aside by the Israelites as a gift to the eternal that I give to the Levites as their share. Therefore I have said concerning them, they shall have no territorial share among the Israelites. Okay, so here we are so far. So far the system is you give a special donation to the priests, and it's the best of your fruit, and what some part of the offering, that's truma. And then, and this is the first tithe, you give a whole tenth of all of your produce to the tribe of the Levites, the whole tribe, because they don't have any land and they can't grow anything themselves. Right? Okay. Let's just pause there. Any questions or concerns or clarifications that people want to articulate so far? We're 2 levels into the system. Sivan?
This is in general about the limits to the contribution or taxation. I read somewhere that rabbis prohibited the truma or any kind of charity to exceed 1/5 of a person's income. So could you elaborate on that?
Yes, great. Okay, so we're going to come back to that at the end of that's the last thing we'll consider, which is what is the system that is currently in place for giving part of your income? Because as we will see, it is based on this idea of the tenth, the tithe, but it's not exactly as Sivan says. There's some idea you can't give more than a fifth or less than a tenth. Where does all that come from? So hold on one second. We'll turn back to that at the end. But before we do, let's just look at the last layer, but it's really like a bifurcated layer of the tithing system. Okay, so there's the truma to the priests, the donation to the priests, not a specified amount. There's the tenth, the actual. This is like where the tenth of your income is based on. That goes to the tribe of Levi, the social servants, so to speak. Okay, and then there is the second tithe. All right, so let's take a look at what that is here, and it's a very, I have to say, it's a strange institution. You'll be surprised by it if you haven't seen it before. Okay, after you give the tithe to the Levites, so now you have 90% of your yield left. Then you set aside every year a 10th part of all the yield of your sowing that is brought to the field. So there's another 10th, although this time it's 9%, right, of the total, right, because we're down to 90. So so now this suddenly seems like, whoa, we just jumped. You're about to give away 19% of your income, but you're not, because listen, you shall consume the tithes of your new grain and wine and oil, and the firstlings, the firstborn of your herds and flock, in the presence of the eternal your God, in the place where God will choose to establish God's name, that'll be the temple, so that you may learn to revere the eternal your God forever. Okay, so this is strange. You tithe, you take 10%, you give it to the Levites, and then you take 10% of what's left, and you bring that, and you go up to the temple, and you just eat it. You eat it there. You enjoy it in the temple, and this is there's 2 more significant pieces here. Back to verse 24 here. Now, let's say you can't make it to the temple. That's a nice idea. But should the distance be too great for you, should you be unable to transport them, because the place where the eternal your God has chosen to establish God's name is far from you, and because the eternal your God has blessed you, you may convert them into money, right? Unatata bakasef. You can turn it into money. This is the first idea we have that a tithe can be something other than just a percentage of the goods themselves. You can convert it into money, wrap the money, and take it with you to the place that the eternal your God has chosen, and then spend the money. If you can't bring all the animals, spend the money on anything you want: cattle, sheep, wine, other alcohol, anything you desire, and you shall feast there, and you shall rejoice with your household. Okay, so that's number 3. We had Truma, the donation of the priest. We had Maser Rishon, the first tithe to the Levite, the tribe of the Levites. And then we have Maser Sheni, the second tithe, which is the third in our system, third unit in our system, which is like 9% of your total income that you eat yourself and you enjoy yourself, okay? Except, and this is the last piece of text we'll look at today, except don't forget the Levite in your community. That is not just the Levites who live in who work in the temple, but the Levites who are around you, who, remember, don't have any land, for he has no hereditary portion as you have. And every 3rd year, you shall bring out the full tithe of your yield of that year, but leave it within your settlements. And then the Levite, who has no hereditary portion, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow in your settlements shall come and eat their fill, so that the eternal, your God, may bless you in all the enterprises you undertake. Okay, so let me just explain this because it's complicated and bizarre. Here's the way the system works. We know that the tithe is for the priests and the Levites. There's Truma and Maser Rishon, and those go to the priests and the Levites, and that's basically like 10% plus whatever donation, special donation you give to the priests. Then there's this other tithe, the amount of your income that you are obligated to enjoy yourself, like a tax that you benefit from, right? And you enjoy it either by eating it or by converting it into money and using it. But every 3rd year, 1, 2, the 3rd year, 4, 5, the 6th year, every 3rd year, and this is a 7-year cycle, so we'll leave the 7th out, but the 3rd and 6th years, gosh, am I confusing you yet? The 3rd and 6th years, that last tithe, which you usually consume yourself, is left for the poor and those who do not have enough. Okay, very, very nice. Oh, finally a tithe for the poor, which is 9% of your income once every 3 years, you know? So it's like, it's actually, we see this and we're like, oh, great, finally, we're actually thinking about those less fortunate. But that's not like the system. And I will remind you, there are other institutions in Jewish law that we've looked at, some of them, that do tend to the poor, the corner of the field. The very notion of tzedakah, like that comes from a different place in the Torah, right? So it's not as if this is the only place we think of the poor, but the tithing system in Jewish law is for the priests, first of all, for the tribe of Levi, second, then some tithe that you give to yourself or enjoy to yourself, and then finally, every 3rd year, that self-given tithe goes to those who are the less fortunate in your society, the less wealthy in your society. Okay, so that's the system, and at least on some basic level, you see and know what the system is. And now we have to think, well, how do we make sense of that system, and how do we convert it into our contemporary system? Yeah, Elle?
There's something that's always struck me about this as the transformation of what is consumed to make it higher, to make it transformed. And this happens when we give to the priests, and the priests are ingesting and with prayer and making it part of a ritual, and changing that nourishment into something else, something higher. And the same thing when we take our percentage and we go to Jerusalem, and during prayer and during the Hagim, we are also transforming that. And and I think that's very significant. And so the food isn't the same. You're looking at a basket of vegetables, but the other basket on the other side, after it's been devoured, eaten by the priests and prayed over, it becomes something else.
Okay, great. That is very, very well said, and very important point to really be considering seriously as we head towards the end of this conversation. One of the things that we have seen here is that the tithing or tax system in Jewish law, it is deeply I don't know what word to use, religious, spiritual. It is, but above all, symbolic. It has a value content. It's about that tribute. It's about that recognition. There's something about, it's sacred. And in fact, this takes us into the laws where you can't eat food that has been untithed, because that's hekdesh, that's sacred. You're not allowed to have that. That's for God. So the whole system is not just about practical social services, but also about like what it means spiritually to acknowledge God's blessing, or to thank those who have been performing God's blessing, or to even to give money to the poor. That's a sacred act. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the other thing is, it is very important, and I think we really have to keep our eyes on what just happened. Yael notes, and I think there's a critical move that's happened here, where you can now convert the goods into, because it's a symbolic act, it can be converted into money or anything else. It's about, you now transfer the blessing onto a different carrier. So it's not just about, we need 10% of all of your grain. It's like, no, you need to perform the act of tithing. And that can be transferred into different ways. And as we feel that happening, we can feel the opening for this institution, which we practice today, of what's called maser ksafim, the tithing of one's money. That's what we call our 10% charity thing today, the tithing of one's money. And here's a big kind of surprise. That 10%, it was a surprise to me anyway. I grew up thinking like, that's Jewish law, you have to do it. And it is Jewish law, but it's not based in the tithing system. It's not technically obligated by the Torah. It is a later rabbinic institution. And essentially, I will tell you, what they did was they looked at the system, the ancient tithing system, which mostly no longer applied because there weren't priests and there wasn't a temple and there wasn't land. We all became Levites. So that whole system is no longer relevant, or wasn't for many thousands of years. You could ask whether it is now. And part of what the rabbis did is they took that system and they said, well, we don't have the means to give the poor the agricultural donations that the Torah mandates. And meanwhile, we're not tithing any of our grains. So what we should do, I mean, you can see the rabbis trying to do exactly what we've been doing, analyze that whole system and extract from it some principle. What are the values here? And the way that they came up with to transfer those values is to say 10% of everyone's income you should consider like maser, but it's maser ksafim, it's money, it's whatever, 10% of your total income. And that should be given to the poor, and should be given to the poor every year. So it's totally different from the old system, and yet it's so clearly based on and drawn from the old system. Okay, so that's at least some sense of like how we get from one to the other. Let's see. I think I saw another hand. Anyone have a hand who hasn't spoken yet? Want to just in our last minute? Ken, yeah, that's who it was. Hi, Ken.
I just wonder if you accept the notion that this was all in the realm of Hezekiah. There was a drop-off in journeying to the temple for the very problem that you couldn't bring your sheep, cattle, whatever it is. And so this was an alternative way to make sure that the charity function was financed by monetizing the economy. And I guess I would assume that, again, if you take the historical view of Hezekiah, I wonder if this is the first time explicitly where the Torah mentions the monetization of religious function.
That's great. So good context there, and that's true. We can read about that in the books of Kings, and it's a great point to end on, because what Ken is pointing out, which is so critical to this discussion, is that we have spent our time trying to understand the ancient system of Jewish tithing, the Torah system of tithing. there's more to do there. I mean, we haven't really why. Well, how does it work, and why every third year, and why would you eat part of it yourself? I mean, there's lots of good work to do there, but at least I think we have the framework. But that's an ancient system, and I'm sure it made some kind of sense when the temple was standing. And why every third year? I don't know. I'm also sure that on some level that made sense to them. But this is an important point that Ken's making, which is a tax system always has to, it's not just an ideal. It always has to take into account the reality of the economics and social structures that it is drawing from. So the tax system is going to have to change over time, right? When the economic reality changes. And every society, it's not a question of whether I'm a libertarian or I'm a social. Every society has to think, well, what's the best tax system to take care of the needs of this society? And there are values and principles that can be debated, but it isn't just a one size fits all, right? Having said that, let me just end, because we're at the end of our time, by saying a couple of things. One, the system that we have, like our tradition has designed, really like in imitation of the tithing system, but really not the actual tithe. The idea of maser ksafim, of giving 10% of your income. And that's where Sivan was asking, the rabbis were like, and you shouldn't give more than 25%, but you shouldn't give less than 10%, unless, as Alan was saying earlier, unless you can't give anything at all. And there's discussions of what you do in that case. But importantly, this is a tithing system. First of all, I want to say this is the one that looks most like what we saw with Jacob originally, which you just give 10% of your income away. In some ways, it's like a return to the earliest division of tithing, which is like, it's not 6 years and 5 years and the this and the that and the priests and like, that's a complicated system. But Jacob said originally, if God gives me blessing, I give away 10% of that. And that, I think, is in some ways the clearest articulation of the ethic underlying our current system of tithing. But the other thing I want to say, and this picks up on what Yael pointed out earlier, the idea that tithing now has been transferred from just food into like all manner of goods is an important movement, and also like an uncertain one, because and you can see the very first Mishna we looked at, they're saying no, tithing only applies to food. It's not like all of your property, right? That debate, there's a debate there, like a sort of a hidden debate over what should be taxed, right? We talked about, we opened with a debate between the flat tax, what is the rate of taxation, the flat, the progressive tax, how much? But there's another debate here over what of what you have do you have to donate some of? And is it just like in the ancient system, it's just like when things grow out of the ground, I have to give over some of them, but I don't have to give part of my land or my house or my or my servants, or right, like there are lots of things that are untouchable. But in the sort of less formal but new system of giving a tenth, then it's a different system. It's like I aggregate the total wealth that I have, and I have to give 10% of all of that, right? So that's, first of all, let's just note that has taken place. But let's also note, and I want to say this in closing, that the debate over what can be taxed is also a huge part of our contemporary social debate, and in a different way than the question of money or land. It also is a relevant question when we think about cases like Citizens United, right? Where we've created other sorts of exemptions that your personal income can be taxed, but corporate income cannot be taxed or taxed in a different way, right? So you start to see how you can think about the system of taxation as applying to only certain kinds of goods, and that's a, that's a slippery place to be, because then you start to, it's not as clean as just give your 10%, right? And then we can start to say like, oh, given the, and this really is the state of tax law, given the laws that I see in place in front of me, how can I wiggle my way around them, right? How can I find loopholes in tax law, which is what people are always inevitably going to do. So we do have to be very careful when we think about what rate of tax, what kind of tax, where taxes are going, but also what exactly is eligible for taxation in our society. So lots to think about there. Some of the as Matt said early on, this is some of the big, it seems very kind of like are prosaic and arcane and even boring, but it actually ends up being some of the most important questions in our in our social order today. So good to be back with you. We'll meet again next week, and happy to be starting off a new year with some Torah. Thanks everybody for your minds and your Torah and your time today. I'll see you next week.